Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation to come and spend 10, 15 minutes talking to you about some of the stuff that I've been working on over the last few years. I think that Confluence is an amazing theme, and I've really loved the last two presentations. In fact, I might even start with something that Rod had talked about. I love that map of sort of Alberta and Saskatchewan and that big sort of stream of blue that is the Aspen Parkland. I wasn't going to specifically talk about Aspen Parkland, but being this sort of space between the grassland biome below and the boreal forest above, it's really like an ecotone of the two. So it is this confluence of two different ecosystems, and where two different ecosystems meet, you actually find a lot of the biodiversity of both of those things, plus a swath of organisms and opportunities that only exist there, which I think makes a lot of sense then why humans have always been attracted to this space, and some of the opportunities that has perhaps led to us being here today. This is me really excited about this tree here, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. So I have been fascinated with trees for a really long time. I grew up actually not too far from Fort Assiniboine, and my parents were really big gardeners. We had lots of trees on the acreage. I kind of spent most of my time running around the forest. I found yard work tedious, because it seemed like I was always fighting nature back, and the forest didn't need any weeding or tilling or squishing bugs or anything like that. It just seemed to thrive, and so I've always been attracted to trees. And I've made Edmonton my home now for since 2001, so most of my life, and very much identify as an Edmontonian at this point. And over those years, still interested in trees, enjoying this lovely river valley that we have. Kind of got connected with some of the other folks in the community who've been interested in what we call heritage trees. And there's been various attempts over the past few decades to catalog them. And so a group of us teamed up to see if we could identify specific trees around the city, learn more about them, try to tell their stories, and I think in the end, that has been an interesting avenue for us to explore our own relationship to this space. And let me kind of show you how. So this tree here, does anybody recognize this one? Unfortunately, it's gone now. Here's a really old picture from the city archives. This was referred to as the Garneau tree. And so this was planted by the Garneaus, probably from seeds or a small seedling that they brought from Manitoba. This is the tree shortly before it was removed. So it was actually, by the time it was removed, it was on the University of Alberta's property. The tree was deemed dangerous. It was the oldest tree in the city of Edmonton's inventory, and one day I showed up and it looked like this. So unfortunately it's gone. The wood has been turned into art, or is being turned into art for the Métis community, which I think is a really great use of that. Manitoba maple, it's kind of funny because you can look out the window here, and I'm willing to bet that quite a few of these trees are Manitoba maple. So it seems odd that you would bring a Manitoba maple, say, from two provinces over and establish it in Edmonton. My hunch is that these trees here would have been exceedingly rare. And in fact, the Manitoba maples that we have throughout the city, and I know people have love-hate relationships with this particular species, probably originates from some of these early trees. The oldest tree in the city of Edmonton, so city of Edmonton owned tree in their inventory, is actually a couple silver maples that are in Westmount, just off the High Street area. They were planted in 1910, which, considering the age of this city, or the length of time in which people have been here, which is thousands of years, is relatively recent. I'm not saying there aren't older trees in the city of Edmonton, but this is the oldest one in the city's inventory. This particular species, not native to here either. We'll wrap back to that. There used to be two beautiful silver maples in the Garneau neighborhood. This isn't too far from the University of Alberta. One remains. Did I say silver maples just now? Sugar maples. Sugar maples, yeah. This is the one that you can get served. This is the one that's on the mat, or on the flag. So these trees here, this tree here, as best I can tell, has been planted, or was planted around 1890. So it's a fairly large, mature silver maple tree, a species that is definitely not common to Edmonton, not native to here, obviously native to Canada, but you'd have to go further east in order to find it. This is a tree that was planted in the Coronation Park. It is often called the Queen Elizabeth Oak because it was planted by Queen Elizabeth. It is not particularly old. It was planted in the 50s. It is a lovely tree. I've got nothing against it in terms of its age. And so this tree often ends up on a lot of heritage tree inventories, not because it's uncommon. We have quite a few bur oaks here, but because of the fact that it was planted by somebody with renown. If you want to find it, if you find the old planetarium, it's essentially planted just directly in front of it. I do not know if this plaque exists. If you'll see on a lot of trees around the city of Edmonton, these plaques, these were created by an organization that was heavily involved in creating a heritage tree inventory in the province around 2006. They published a wonderful book called Heritage Trees of Alberta in 2008, and then their database crashed, and unfortunately they lost all of their data and disbanded as an organization. So a lot of the work that we've been doing since has been a little bit of trying to dig up a lot of that previous work that thousands of volunteers put into cataloging trees around the province. This is one of my favorite plants. I don't know if you can call this a tree, but this here is some wild goji berries growing through the river valley. There are quite a few wild patches of goji, mostly along mostly along downtown and very close to what would have been sort of the initial Chinatown. The thing about all of these species that I've mentioned so far, because I haven't talked about native plants, is that these are species that people have brought here. And so people have these very special relationships with the plants that they tend. And as we move around as a species, we tend to want to bring some of those relationships with us. So that could be a specific variety of tomato that you've got from your grandmother or your grandparents. But often it's a lot of plants that were used for food or for medicine. And so when our early Chinese community came here in Edmonton, they also brought lots of plants with them, and they would have added these to their yards, to their market gardens. And there's some indication that, some of these are probably spread by birds, but other ones are probably the remnants of actual market gardens that were once established in the river valley. There's a really lovely book by Catherine Chase Merritt called Why Grow Here? And I won't try to redo her work, but she estimates that there was at least 15 Chinese market gardens throughout the city of Edmonton, mostly in the river valley. And so it's likely that some of these goji patches originated from those gardens. Here's me excited about that tree. This is another plant that is presently native to China. I want to say presently because depending on your timeline, that could change. This plant actually evolved in what is now North America, spread across the entire globe, went extinct everywhere except for China, and is now sort of making its way around the globe again, thanks to humans. This is Ginkgo biloba. It's actually a conifer. This tree evolved about 250 million years ago. It has separate male and female trees. These are actually needles that are sort of fanned outwards, and the female trees make a fruit that I've never smelled, but is described to me as a combination between vomit and feta cheese. We generally plant male trees. This is a male tree. The tree co-evolved with dinosaurs, and so what that stinky fruit is trying to do is attract scavenging dinosaurs. The dinosaurs have gone extinct. The tree doesn't realize it yet. These are often planted in Asia. These are often planted on religious sites. Very interesting trees. And this is one that is at the University of Alberta, though there are handfuls of them around the city. I have about 50 little ones in my backyard. Yes, half of them should be female, so get ready. This is a willow. I don't know the exact species of this. We do have native willow plants, and so it could be that this is a native plant. I suspect that it's a laurel leaf willow. Have you seen it down in Government House Park? It kind of looks like a giant came along and stomped on it, and all of the branches have fallen down. This is my nephew Gus, and we would head down here, and Gus and his sister Maggie would basically crawl all over this tree and use it as a jungle gym. This tree often makes it into heritage resources, not because it was planted by someone of renown, not because it's a particularly rare species, but because of its unusual sort of growth habit. Here's another one that's a fairly common tree. I think this is actually a black spruce. It's down kind of below Saskatchewan Drive on the south side. Someone told me it had this big giant spike in it. I don't even know if the spike is old, but I want to know the story of the spike. So this tree kind of ended up on a list of heritage trees through in the province, throughout the city, mostly because of this perhaps like artifact that is embedded in it, which may or may not have any historic significance. And so let's find out, and we'll see if it's added. How many people know the Hollowash horse chestnut tree? Oh, yeah. So Walter Hollowash was sent to Vienna to study the violin. He ends up later in his life actually playing for the Edmonton Symphony. While he was in Vienna, he picked up at least one horse chestnut seed off the ground. In Vienna, they use these horse chestnut trees as boulevard trees. He, smuggled it back in his violin case. I can't imagine people were maybe inspecting for seeds as much as they do now. Planted it in the backyard, and it survived. The backyard can now be found. Well, the backyard's where it's always been, but the backyard is. The easiest way to find it is actually through the back alley just south of Jasper Avenue off 106th Street. It's in a parking lot. It's a big, beautiful, giant horse chestnut tree. And what's interesting about this, it's often sort of the poster tree for heritage trees in Edmonton, in that, it's old, planted in the 20s, so it's 100 years old now. It's not a very common species, and we sort of know the story or the narrative behind it. What's interesting about this tree is it's almost been cut down. Every 20 years, it seems like it's threatened to be cut down, and every 20 years, people learn that it's going to be cut down, and they sort of rally and they show up like when the bulldozers are there, and it gets saved for another 20 years. And I think it's a really interesting story of resilience. They make these nuts, right? I've actually grown quite a few trees from this. They make these nuts as little conkers. Has anybody played the game Conkers? I have not. We have at least one person here. I'm not going to put you on the spot to explain the rules, but from what I understand, you basically like push a shoelace, push a hole through the nut, put a shoelace through it, tie a knot on the end, and so you and your opponent each have a nut on the end of a string. And I wasn't planning on talking about any of this. And you swing it at your opponent's nut, and you try to break it off. And if you break it off, then you win and you proceed to the next round. And I'm just throwing it out there now, but Edmonton's first annual Conquer tournament, 2024. But let me know if you want to make that happen. This is a bristlecone pine that is growing down in Riverdale. Bristlecone pine it's got this really kind of, looks like a pipe cleaner tree, or it looks like something you'd find in an ocean, bottom of the ocean. And sorry for the the lack of contrast with this photo here. This tree here would be related to a native plant, which is the whitebark pine here in sort of our Rocky Mountains, which is an endangered species. These would be native to like Colorado, the high mountains of Colorado and New Mexico. They do very well here. What's interesting is because they're a high alpine species and our climate is changing, they keep moving up the mountains to colder and colder climates, and that's becoming an island that's getting smaller and smaller. They don't unfortunately have the ability to walk and move over to the next mountain range. Turns out they do very well in Edmonton, and they have the ability to live for thousands of years if the conditions are counterintuitively terrible. They live in these really rough, like super sunny, wind, crazy cold winter environments. And so if they're babied too much, they grow fast and burn out. But given really harsh conditions, they can live a really long time. So I've been talking about heritage trees. What makes a heritage tree? There's not really like an agreed upon definition. Generally, they tend to be like big or old or uncommon or have some kind of weird, unique growth habit, or I don't know, like a spike through the middle of it for some reason. And they tend to have some kind of story. I think you can kind of sum this up by saying like any tree that is loved could be a heritage tree. Like, I think it can be as simple as that. Big is interesting because that takes time, right? If you want a big tree, that takes a lot of time. This is a Rocky Mountain Douglas fir, so this is native to Alberta. It's a subspecies of the Douglas fir that you'd find on the West Coast. Those trees slowly work their way up the Rocky Mountains, and then they've been working their way down the other side into Alberta. It's much drier here, so they're much more adapted to drier conditions. Can be a very big tree, can be a very old tree. It takes time to grow a big tree, though. And some species don't get big, and some species don't get old. So if you take a list of all of the potential species out there, all the plants, and you say, okay, here's everything we're working with, these ones get big, these ones get old, you've already sort of eliminated a bunch of plants that you wouldn't normally find in there. They tend to be uncommon or unique. Well, that sort of discounts native plants, right? If it's native sort of not always, but by definition, it tends to be a lot more abundant. We don't tend to see a lot of balsam poplar, aspen poplar, white spruce in these heritage plant inventories. We might see them because they're big or they've got an uncommon growth habit, but we kind of discount them, which is unfortunate. Also, once rare plants can become very common, I think Manitoba maple would be a really good example of that, right? When they planted a Manitoba maple, which I kind of just got the corner of it here, in front of Rutherford House, I imagine they're going, hey, this is going to be the premier's house, right? This is where the premier is going to live. We need to have this beautiful garden. They have a beautiful garden. What kind of tree are we going to stick out front? And they're like, Manitoba maple. And now if you just cross Saskatchewan Drive and you just look at the forest, it's like 90% Manitoba maple, right? So what's common changes. Also, common plants can become rare too, and so this is kind of a moving target. And I think this one out of the sort of three defining characteristics of a heritage tree is the one that sticks the most. It's attached to some kind of historic event or a person or a culture, or it has some kind of narrative behind it. And what makes that interesting to me is that a tree gets older over time, it gets bigger over time. How unique something is, it ebbs and it flows and it changes. A story is something you have to retell continuously. It's you consciously need to keep saying it. And if you don't, if there's a break in that, it can be lost. And so that's kind of been, I think, for me, maybe the interesting piece that I've gleaned from heritage trees is what are these stories? What can we collect? How can we pass that on? Most likely candidates then tend to be introduced plants or species, so non-natives, large, long-lived species, and attached to some kind of person or event or culture. This is that hollowash tree in the early 90s. It has grown considerably since then. If you kind of put a bunch of species on a long-lived, short-lived, common, unique sort of status, right? Like we tend to find, a pocket of trees here that end up on these heritage tree lists. Something that is common and long-lived, like an aspen, tend not to show up. Now, aspen, I'd say long-lived, because ironically, probably some of the oldest trees in the world are aspen poplar trees. Not because an individual trunk is that old, but because they're a clonal species. Most of the plant is underground, and what it does, you can imagine it's growing horizontal and it's sending up branches. Each individual branch we think of as a tree, and it maybe lives 40, 60 years. But the organism itself has the ability to live for tens of thousands of years. So it wouldn't surprise me, being an aspen parkland, if we have aspen trees in our river valley or surrounding environments that are actually tens of thousands of years old. At least maybe not tens of thousands. I guess we got to go back to the, we've got kind of a firm glacial period there that's probably our hard stop. A common short-lived tree like a chokecherry. Not a lot of chokecherries on these tree inventories. There is one that was planted at Grant MacEwan and sort of dedicated to Grant MacEwan. And there's one that was planted by the city of Edmonton in commemoration of the tornado. And so those are the two chokecherry trees on the inventory. Both of those trees are would be nearing the edge of their natural lives. This is a little bit of a tangent. I don't know where I'm at in my 15 minutes, but I am going to wrap this up. There's a project right now that is a community of us who are trying a bit of a thought experiment. The question I guess we're trying to answer is, can you grow a heritage tree? Like most of these plants they're stuck in the ground, and then somebody like myself 50, 100 years later goes, cool tree, we should add it to a list. What would that look like if you were to start day one, like sowing a seed or planting a tree? And so we had this kind of quirky idea of seeing if we could grow 1,000-year-old trees throughout the city of Edmonton, which has been like a weird kind of mental thing to wrap our minds around, which turns out is probably the point of the whole project, because I think in order to grow 1,000-year-old anything, it's more about what kind of community do you need to create that cares about long-term thinking, that cares about, like creating a greener, more abundant future. This is a total tangent, but this is a 700-year-old camphor tree in Japan. It was slated to be removed because it was basically in direct conflict with a train station that was going to be built. The community rallied behind this tree and said, no, leave the tree alone. And the city had to redesign the train station to incorporate this tree, which to be honest, I think is incredibly beautiful, and something that could sort of only happen in this particular space, right? Like, this is a very unique coming together of the built environment and of the natural environment, and I think that makes like really interesting, unique places. And it's this kind of tie to the past as well, and I think maybe like a nice sort of like, we're going to take this gift of this tree or this relationship, and we're going to steward it, and we're going to at least do our best to move that into the future so that it can, continue to flourish. Least likely candidates: slow-growing species, short-lived species, small trees and shrubs, young trees, and common native species. We don't tend to see these in inventories. And so, what about these plants here? What about a lot of the trees and shrubs that we see outside of the window? I'm willing to bet that if you were to walk out into just any kind of random patch here, and from where you're standing, if you could just look at a circle and you could think about, if you could identify the plants around it, you are going to see this very interesting combination of native plants that have been here for thousands of years and that have a long history and culture of use, and these sort of more recent arrivals that more recent groups of settlers have brought. So you're going to find things like your native Saskatoons and your currants and gooseberries. You're going to find your high bush cranberries. There's tons of them just walking around Laurier here. But you're also going to find little oak trees. You're also going to find cotoneaster. You're also going to find crabapple seedlings. And in a weird way, the river valley and the plants in this river valley and the plants in the city are this representation of the cultures and the communities and the values that sort of we have all individually brought to the city. And so, much like, I don't know, maybe this is an extreme example, or maybe outside the window is an extreme example, but I think that the only place that you're going to find this particular combination of relationships, of plants, of novel ecosystems, of this mishmash of non-native and native species is here. We have this really kind of unique thing that is a reflection of ourselves, and so I think that is a pretty neato confluence. And I'll end there. Thank you.